I guess they keep changing the settings on Zoom every time I do something. There's something new here, but in any case, that's the way it goes with this technology. So, Mark, I'm going to give you an opportunity to share. I guess we'll do a little introduction, then I'm going to turn over hosting to you, okay?
That sounds great.
And what I'll ask people to do, just as we go around, is just say their name, where they're from, and if they're with a congregation, you know, where that is. Okay, and so Andy, I got you in the top left hand, and then after we're all done,
Okay.
I'm gonna do a quick introduction for our guest tonight, Mark Paul, and then turn over hosting to him. So Andy, why don't you tell us?
Sure. Well, you see my name there, Andy Orm. I should say my pronouns, he, him, his. I'm in the Boston area in a synagogue in a suburb, Temple Shir Tikva of Winchester. David Schreiber doesn't seem to be here tonight, but oh yes, David is here.
I just got here.
Yeah, there he
Right.
is, yes.
And we are also
to
both
be interrupted by dinner any minute.
So we are both in Shir Tikva and both volunteering along with Fred Davis for the Jewish Climate Action Network of Massachusetts.
Okay, so we going to be well represented from the Boston area here tonight. Okay, Bob Kibrick, I've got you next.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Great. Bob Kibrick with Temple Bethel in Aptos, California, which is in Santa Cruz County. And I just want to share the big news today from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California that ruled that cities and jurisdictions bringing climate lawsuits against fossil fuel companies can be tried in state court. And my city and county is one of those jurisdictions, along with a number of other cities and counties in California and in other states. So this is wonderful news.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Kol hakavod.
Okay, John Brown, what I'm going to do, yeah, you guys are all doing good practicing, good protocol here is when you get it, when John, you know, unmute yourself and then introduce yourself quickly and then mute yourself back up and we'll go on to the next person. John.
Okay, hi. I was going to ask Bob, who has to mute himself, was that a state or a federal court that made that ruling? You have to unmute yourself.
That was the federal court, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California.
Okay,
and so it denied requests from the oil defendants that were Chevron, Exxon, BP, ConocoPhillips, and Shell.
great. Yeah, so I'm another one of the northern Boston suburb folks on the call, also in JCAN and also associated with Winchester, although unlike the others who belong to the congregation in Winchester, I live in Winchester, but I belong to the congregation in Lexington, which is Temple Isaiah. That's probably all you need to know. Thanks.
Great, thanks, John. Judy Brofine, I've got you next.
Okie doke. Well, I'm excited to see a few other Californians on the call. I'm from Encinitas, just north of San Diego, from Temple Solel. And I also run the Jewish Action Team of Citizens Climate Lobby. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks, Judy. Ellen Siegel.
Hi, Ellen Siegel. I'm the chair of the Green Team at Temple Shir Shalom. We're a small congregation in Gainesville, Florida.
Thank you, Ellen. David Schreiber.
Well, I thought Andy Orem already introduced me. I'm a member of Temple Shir Tikva in Winchester. I live in Arlington, Massachusetts, and I'm a member of the Jewish Climate Action Network and the Climate Action Business Association / Climate Exchange.
Thank you, David. Andrew.
Hi, everybody. Andrew Goldenkrantz, Temple Bethel in Aptos, congregant with Bob. And in addition to the California work, I'm one of the 2 co-leagues for the National RAC cohort on climate environment. Good to be here.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Fred. I don't know if Fred's on here. I'm going to go, I guess that's Lisa.
Yes, hi.
Okay, you want to give us your full name there and where you're calling from?
Lisa Friedman. I'm calling from Los Angeles.
Great, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Lisa, I guess I think she's not. I'm going to see if I can scroll up and Lisa is from the ICAR Congregation Green Action Team from Los Angeles on Green Action Minion SEDEC, along with many fellow travelers from ICAR. Okay, let's see if we got some others on here. Jennifer Bender.
Hi, I'm from Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm a member of Temple Israel, and I'm on the green team there.
Great, thank you. Is it Relly Wapner?
It is. Hi, calling in from Santa Monica, California. I'm Director of Programs in Los Angeles for the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. I got connected to this through the ICAR congregation.
Great, thank you. Fred Davis.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm late. Fred Davis with Jewish Climate Action Network in Massachusetts, member of Temple Beth David in Westwood.
Great, thank you. Joan Racklin.
Sorry I'm late. I am Joan Racklin. Thank you, Scott. I'm from Temple Israel in Boston. I am founder of the Green Team and have chaired it for 5 years and about to pass the mantle to a co-chair. And I'm a very ardent admirer of HGI's work and Scott's leadership.
Thanks, Joan. Adrian Kaltman.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to be back. I haven't been able to attend the last couple of meetings, but I'm very excited about moving forward. I'm also from Broward County, Florida, like Scott, and I belong to Temple Kolami Emmanuel. And I serve on the Broward County Climate Change Task Force and my local municipality's environmental advisory board. And I also serve as chair of the Broward County chapter of the Democratic Environmental Caucus of Florida.
Great, thanks, Adrian. Sipra Nemeth.
Hi, I am in Los Angeles and I'm a member of ICAR and I work with Elisa. Nice to be here.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Jofi. I'm at Temple Solel with Scott in Hollywood, Florida.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm going to give a brief introduction to Mark and then turn over my hosting duties to him. We're thrilled to have him join us this evening. Mark Paul is an assistant professor of economics and environmental studies at New College in Sarasota. And he's a political economist there who studies inequality and climate crisis and how to address it, as well as climate change and environmental policy there. He teaches classes on political economy, food and agricultural, and economics of race, gender, and discrimination, among other things. And he writes papers on a variety of subjects, including robots, CSAs, and flood mitigation. You know, I saw him on I was looking up the subject after our last monthly meeting on green recovery, and he's, some of you may have seen, he's on a video on the economics of green recovery with several well-known economists, and you know, the tape was really mesmerizing. I mean, there's a lot of important things I think to look at with that, with respect to what is a green recovery, and I hope some of you will be able to spend some time looking at that. And he was kind enough to accept an invitation sort of the last minute to be able to spend a few minutes with us this evening and sort of outline what a green recovery might be, and maybe and answer some questions that you might have about where we're going with this green recovery. And so we're so excited to be here. So thank you, Mark, and maybe also for the people who live in Florida, you might put in a word or two at some point about what it means to teach in this state and what kind of reactions we're getting for that. And let me go ahead and oops, I'm gonna close that part. I'm gonna put you in charge here. Let's see, Mark, and make you host. And I'm gonna say yes. And you should be able to, you are now the host. So you should be in
Great.
charge.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here this evening. Does everybody just see my PowerPoint that I've pulled up here?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I am actually calling in from Jackson, New Hampshire, up in the White Mountains right now. I do live in Florida most of the year. However, I'm actually from Framingham, Massachusetts, not too far from where many of you are from. And I've been now down in Florida teaching for the past 2 years, but we came up here to spend a few months social distancing in the mountains, which is a little bit more pleasant than trying to social distance in Florida for a variety of reasons, particularly given the extreme heat in the summer there. So I am a professor at New College of Florida, which is it's a strange place. It is a public honors liberal arts school. So, you know, you have a traditional 10-to-1 student-teacher ratio, but it's a public school where students just pay standard public tuition as part of the University of Florida system, and a really fantastic place. And then I'm also a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, which is a progressive economic think tank in Washington, D.C. and New York, as well as a senior fellow at Data for Progress, which is another think tank in D.C. That specializes in opinion polling regarding particularly progressive legislation. So I'm going to try to talk relatively briefly right now, and just give a bit of an introduction and hopefully have a little bit more robust time for questions and answers. But before I get started, I want to mention my work for a green recover really comes out of kind of two different areas. First, it's been a long-standing agenda of mine to work with policymakers to try to implement a robust decarbonization program of our economy in order to both rapidly reduce carbon emissions and help transition the economy to sustainable footing, but also do so in a just and sustainable way that protects workers and protects particularly low and middle income families across the United States as well as the world. Second, I've been working with a number of the presidential candidates back during the Democratic primary, and a group of us that advised the Sanders, Warren, and Inslee campaign recently came together and wrote a major open letter to Congress calling for a green recovery. And I'm happy to share some of the links at the end of this call. That once the COVID-19 crisis hit, that has gotten a lot of traction and that we've been working on further developing on the Hill. So that's kind of the background for where this work comes out of. So briefly, I just want to talk about the current problem that we're actually facing. So as a nation, we're really facing three converging crises at this time. We have the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course, as all of you know, is the largest public health crisis we've had in now over a century. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had to shut down the economy. And due to the outbreak, we've seen a utter collapse of the economy, resembling the Great Depression. So this is the largest economic downturn that literally any of us alive have ever witnessed. And it's quite troubling. And I'll get to some of the more detailed numbers in just a minute. But what we're seeing right now is that tens of millions of Americans are struggling to meet their absolute basic needs. So for instance, recent data shows that for single mothers with children under 12, 40% of them currently are having a hard time or, quote, very hard time keeping food on the table in order to feed themselves and their children. At the same time, we know that more than 1 in 4 Americans are currently out of work. And we know that in the first place, 40% of Americans before the crisis did not even have $400 in their savings account to meet an emergency expense. Keep in mind, $400 is not a lot of money. That does not even cover an ER visit, right? $400 is basically blowing a tire on your car while you're driving. $400 is, maybe getting sick and missing a couple days of work. But it's certainly not going to protect you from a major crisis. And when we see tens of millions of Americans losing their jobs with little to no savings, we should be deeply worried about those people's basic well-being and their ability to simply meet basic human needs like food, water, shelter, etc. Second, we're also dealing with the climate emergency. And of course, these are interrelated. Right now, as many of you all know, we have already warmed the planet by over 1.1 degrees Celsius. We are already feeling the effects of global warming. Just a few years ago, we were consistently talking about our grandchildren and polar bears and what this meant for future generations. And it's true that we should be deeply concerned with future generations, but we also need to think about the here and now as well and open up our eyes to the fact that climate change is already here. It's already affecting our daily lives, and it's already affecting our lived environment. And unfortunately, what we know is that we have very, very little time to act on the climate front. The third crisis that we're currently navigating at the same time is the economic inequality crisis. So, as many of you may have heard, Kennedy had this famous quote that a rising tide lifts all boats. Unfortunately, that's simply not been the case. We have this idea of the American dream. If you work hard, play by the rules, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. However, the economic data show that's simply not the case. The average American worker that is not a manager, so what I'm looking at there is about 70% of the workforce, so non-managerial workers, have literally not seen a raise in an entire generation. So Americans are continuing to work extremely hard, yet they're not able to get ahead. And we see this playing out in the data I mentioned earlier, where about 40% of Americans don't have that basic $400 in savings to meet their needs. At the same time, we have the rich getting increasingly more wealthy and powerful, which allows them not only to have economic power, but also undue political power, given the structure of our current political system. So these are the problems we are currently facing at this time. So I just wanted to put this in perspective for a second. So what we're looking at here are weekly state-level unemployment insurance claims. And what you see that there's some traditional noise where jobless claims go up and down. That's basically people engaging in seasonal work, losing their jobs, changing jobs. The dark gray bars are when we have an economic recession. So you see their upticks during economic recession times. But you can clearly see that since 1967, when we started collecting this data, there's just absolutely nothing that comes anywhere close to the type of crisis that we're currently facing. So as of last Thursday, when we got our most recent data out, over 33 million Americans have filed for traditional unemployment. And an additional 4 million Americans have filed for unemployment under a new unemployment program that the government started that's primarily targeting what are called independent contractors. So I think an Uber driver has a very hard time filing for traditional unemployment, but they're currently out of work, and the government created a new program to target those what are also referred to as gig workers or self-employed workers. So what this translates into is about a 25% unemployment rate. That's nothing like anything we've ever seen. For context, in the Great Recession, the unemployment rate peaked at 10.8%. So we're already well more than double that rate. Right now, the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States, is expecting unemployment to peak at between 28 and 32% this summer and stay there through the summer. So that's 1 in 3 Americans essentially unemployed. What that's not counting is the millions of Americans that have simply given up looking for a job because they think that there's just no chance of them being able to find work. So these numbers are really the fairly optimistic version of the unemployment numbers that we're looking at. broader measures of unemployment that are also put out by the Federal Reserve indicate that we already may be approaching 30% unemployment and might be going upwards of 35% unemployment. So it's really hard to overstate how dire the situation is. And to boot, we've unfortunately spent decades eroding the social safety net here in the United States, which would traditionally kick in and protect the most vulnerable people, providing them with adequate food stamp, what used to be called food stamps, what are now called supplemental nutritional assistance program, and other vital programs, housing vouchers and the like, to make sure that people can keep a roof over their head and food on the table. So the important question, what I hope we can spend most of today talking about, is how do we move forward from here? Briefly, what has been done to date? You've all probably read about the fact that the government has now passed 4 different large spending programs in order to mitigate the economic downfall from the COVID-19 crisis. But what I want to stress to all of you is that these 4 programs that we've passed, the largest being the CARES Act, which was a $2.2 trillion injection of federal funds into the economy. These are not stimulus dollars. Okay, these are not funds that are meant to get the economy back to work. What these funds are targeted as a stopgap measure to basically stop the bleeding of the patient that is our entire U.S. economy. So they're trying to do things like keep businesses from filing bankruptcy, keep renters from being evicted, keep homeowners from going underwater and losing their homes due to mortgage default, or you losing your car due to falling behind on your payments. It is not yet at this time has the federal government passed large-scale what we call fiscal stimulus measures, which are really measures aimed at kickstarting the economy and getting things moving back again. Before we're able to do that, what we first need to do is really get the public health crisis under control. So I'm sure you've all seen the news. Plenty of people are talking about reopening the economy. We all know that Trump is very eager to quote unquote reopen the economy. But it's an important question to ask, what do we actually mean by reopening the economy? It of course varies based on all the states that we're in. But what we've seen from states that have started to reopen the economy is that, as a matter of fact, consumers aren't going back out and spending because they don't feel safe. And what we know is that they shouldn't feel safe, that in most areas, public health experts are telling us that the public health crisis is not over. We have flattened the curve to a degree, but we have not actually bent it down. We still have over 20,000 and often 25,000 new cases per day. And we're still in the midst of a massive public health crisis. What's interesting is that the economists are not the ones that have been arguing for a rapid reopening of the economy. The economists have been saying that the best way to protect the economy is to first address the public health crisis. I'm not sure if somebody hasn't put themselves on mute, by the way. If you don't mind, if you're on mute, that would be much appreciated. We just have a lot of background noise here. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to note that the economists have not been the one pushing for the reopening, largely because if businesses reopen before consumers are ready to come back, those businesses are going to face rising costs, reopening costs, without seeing significant increases in revenue, because after all, if consumers aren't coming to the stores and spending money, businesses are going to be in deep trouble. Once we get the public health crisis under control, we need to focus on a robust economic recovery. But it's important to ask what that actually might entail. And what I argue and want to spend the rest of the evening talking about is that we should focus our economic recovery on engaging in a program of crash decarbonization that will simultaneously put people back to work while rapidly reducing emissions in the United States and bring us to net neutral emissions by 2040 at the latest. So it sounds like most of you are all quite familiar with the climate problem. We can talk about this more if need be. These are just 2 graphs from the most recent 2018 IPCC report that basically shows that at this time, if we continue with business as usual, we're on track to reach about 4 degrees C by end of the century. That's a terrifying, terrifying outlook. if we look at the UN representative from the Marshall Islands, for instance, he refers to just 2 degrees C, let alone 4°C, as genocide for many island nations across the globe. What scientists do tell us, though, and this is what's most promising, is that we have the technical ability to engage in a crash decarbonization program to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. The primary hurdle is not, in fact, an economic one or a technical one, but is indeed a political one. And happy to discuss that more. So just for reference, I want to show you all what my community in Florida looks like. 2 degrees warming on the right, 4 degrees warming on the left. Even at 2 degrees of warming, these barrier islands, Longboat Key, Siesta Key, Sarasota, these contain thousands upon thousands of homes where full-time and seasonal residents live. Even at 2 degrees C, those are gone. Not to mention the fact that our downtown is inundated. At 4 degrees C, which is what we're currently on track for, vast majority of Florida, over 80% of residents who currently live in Florida will see their homes inundated. Basically, we'll have to abandon the state. We already have.
Excuse me, Mark.
Yes.
Just to be clear, here the dark blue is
the dark.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize. That's a great question. So the tan is landmass. So all this area is landmass. This area, I think you can see my mouse, as well as landmass. And then the blue that's covering the landmass are areas that are permanently inundated with floodwaters due to rising sea levels. So thank you. That was an important clarifying question. I should have explained that.
Thank you.
No problem. So, you know, I don't need to convince you further that 2 degrees C is deeply, deeply troubling, and 4 degrees C would be absolutely devastating. So what we need to do is focus on a recovery that uses a decarbonization strategy. What we call for is a $2 trillion a year decarbonization effort. That is roughly equivalent to perspective. The CARES Act that Congress recently passed was about $2.2 trillion. So we're calling for basically a doubling of recent stimulus spending, but this funding being focused on rebuilding the economy. And that should be repeating every year for a minimum of 10 years, or as what we call for in our work, until you have 2 things. A, the economy has sustained levels of unemployment below 3.5 degrees, and B, you have reached a net neutral carbon economy here in the United States. In terms of what this would do, it would be directed towards vital investment programs that would create millions of family-sustaining jobs. It would allow us to deliver strategic investments across the economy, and in particular, revitalize relatively depressed localities. You think of areas such as Detroit, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and other regions that have been struggling. It would allow us to expand public and employee ownership of key assets, and would result in rapid cuts to carbon emissions here in the United States. In terms of the areas that we focus on, and I'm happy to get into the details of any of these during the question and answer, we break it down into seven buckets. First is housing, buildings, and civic infrastructure. So buildings, you know, we're all sitting in a home or office at this moment, but buildings actually account for 40% of emissions here in the United States. So buildings should be an absolute top priority for decarbonization efforts. And in order to fully decarbonize buildings, you need 2 things. One is to eliminate all existing fossil fuel infrastructure in the buildings. So thinking about taking out gas stoves and other appliances. And 2 is to increase energy efficiency of those buildings as well. There's plenty of states that have wildly successful energy efficiency programs for both commercial and residential buildings. 2 of the best, where we have many folks on this call from, are actually in Massachusetts and California, where we've seen, for every dollar invested into decarbonizing buildings in those states, for residential buildings, we've seen a return on investment of $4, And for commercial buildings, we've seen $5.50. So these are not only investments that will help put people to work and investments that will help decarbonize the economy, but they're also investments that will help save renters, homeowners, and business owners money in the long run, which is quite important as well. Second is transportation. Transportation is actually our second largest emitting source. I'm sorry, transportation is now our largest emitting source here in the United States, accounting for about 30% of emissions. And what that really needs to focus on is not only building out public transit, but also other things like a mass build out of electric vehicle production in the United States to rapidly get internal combustion engines off the roads as soon as possible. Another area of vital importance to focus on here is a just transition. So it's quite necessary that we ensure that we protect the livelihoods of fossil fuel workers across this country. We still have over 1 million workers directly employed in the fossil fuel industry. And while we might villainize, while we should villainize the fossil fuel corporations and executives for their actions, I think it is of critical importance that we protect and promote the well-being of the actual fossil fuel workers who are simply doing their job to make sure that you and I can have this conversation right now, and to make sure that, and for them to be able to put food on the table for their families. Energy systems is another area of critical importance. So this is the build out of renewable energy across the United States, as well as improvement of transmission systems. So one of the biggest problems is that, the wind is not always blowing in some areas and the sun is not always shining in other regions. But thankfully, the United States has an enormous land mass where we can take advantage of the variability in different renewable sources across the country if we're actually able to interconnect our grid, which there have been fantastic reports that highlight that would have a major benefit, not only economically, but also for the climate as well. And the last one I'll mention is innovation policy, actually. So this is something that is actually not only wildly popular amongst Democrats, but also incredibly popular amongst Republicans as well, which is that the federal government inject significant amounts of money into existing programs to help facilitate innovation. So right now we have a program called ARPA-E, which is basically where the solar panel came out of. It's also related to the program that was the major seed funder for Tesla, the incredibly successful electric car vehicle. And it's also where about 80% of the technology for all of our smartphones comes from is direct federal investment in innovation policy. So this is an area that has broad support that we should inject funds into. And what's interesting here is that a lot of people, when they think about things like housing and transportation, they're really thinking about blue collar jobs. And it's true that federal investment in these areas will create millions and millions of blue collar jobs, but they'll also create millions of white collar jobs, ranging from lawyers and accountants and economists to scientists. And others that will be working on continuously improving the technology we currently have in place in order to help us decarbonize as quickly as possible. So in terms of the key takeaways before we get to the Q&A, we are indeed in the midst of a depression at this time. It's really hard to overstate the economic catastrophe we're in the midst of. Some of you might have been reading about this idea of a V-shaped recovery where the economy will rapidly bounce back. I think that is extremely, extremely unlikely. I wish it were true. But I just simply don't think that there's any reasonable reading of the data to suggest that that's the case. I think we're looking at many, many years of economic strife here in the United States. I think it's really important to know, though, that the government does indeed have the tools to protect our public health and economic well-being. This economic crisis, while severe, can be managed through smart government policy. We saw this in the great financial crisis of 2008, 2010, where the government passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and rapidly started getting the economy back on track. However, then when deficit hawks reared their head and decided to pull back spending, called started heaving and hawing about the debt ceiling and concerns regarding inflation. What did we see? We saw austerity, and that in turn led to a double dip recession and a prolonged jobless recovery from the Great Recession. And we want to be sure that we learned our lessons from the past, and not only step on the gas, but keep our foot on the gas pedal, that is fiscal stimulus, until the economy recovers to full employment and until we have successfully decarbonized the economy at the same time. And finally, and I apologize for the typo at the end there, I just want to note that the cost of inaction, the cost of the government doing too little here in terms of spending, far outweigh the cost of the government spending too much. And while this was historically a relatively fringe position amongst left-leaning economists, it's a position that's become increasingly shared across the economic profession in just the past 4 or 5 years, primarily from looking at lessons learned from the previous Great Recession. So with that, I'll end it and open up for questions, and I appreciate the time.
Scott, you're on mute if you're trying to talk.
Scott, you're muted, yeah.
Sorry about that. What if
And
now we
Scott,
got most people back on screen? I guess
I
we
just
got
made
a
you the
mix.
host.
Looks like we've got about a mix of people who we can see and half that we can't see. So if you are not visible, maybe you can unclick yourself and we can recognize you. If you are visible, if you got your camera working and you have a question, do you want to raise your hand maybe and we can call on you? Judy, you have a question?
Sure. Well, Mark, thank you very much. I guess my main question is, how with this administration do we make that dream happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, thankfully, there's advantages and disadvantages of having a federalist system. One of the major lessons we can learn, though, regarding how do we actually get climate legislation passed, is looking at how localities like Massachusetts, Michigan, Ohio, up until recently, California, and Oregon, Washington, how have they done it? It's a pretty straightforward answer, and it's not going to surprise you. They elect Democrats. The most important thing to do is ensure that there comes a rapid end to the Trump administration, to regain Democratic control of the White House, and to hopefully flip the Senate. Mitch McConnell is literally the most dangerous person in Washington, in my opinion, as somebody who spends a lot of time talking with policymakers on the Hill. So I don't think that I don't think we should kid ourselves. I don't think that there's any chance of passing a green stimulus under the current administration. But I don't think that there's much chance of passing a robust round of stimulus in the first place right now, let alone a green one. So I think that that's really going to have to, unfortunately, wait until the next administration. And so there, it's important that not only that Biden wins, but also that we get that McConnell does not maintain majority leadership in the Senate. That said, there's a tremendous amount that state and local governments can and should be doing in the meantime. But one of the biggest challenges is that when we do have large-scale economic downturns, state and local governments also feel the pinch because most of them have to carry balanced budgets, whereas the federal government has the power to run major deficits, which is exactly what we should be doing at this time. But really, the focus needs to be on electoral politics. But that focus also needs to hold Democrats accountable. As we saw with President Obama, when he took office, he promised time and time again to be a climate champion. And I apologize to the Obama fans in the room, but Obama was one of the most devastating presidents in our history for the environment. He oversaw the largest expansion of drilling in US history, larger than any Republican. He failed at critical times to stop the expansion of pipelines. And he agreed to open up numerous protected wildlife areas to oil and gas drilling. So, unfortunately, we haven't had a Democrat in office that's really been a climate leader. Obama also failed to put his weight behind Waxman-Markey, which was our primary hope of getting major environmental legislation passed. A lot of people argue that Obama only had the political power to do one thing, and he chose the Affordable Care Act. I don't think that that's true. I think that he could have put his weight behind both. And I think that there's a real possibility that he could have gotten both done. That said, it's easy to look back at history and try to write an alternative narrative. And we simply don't know what the other path could have looked like if he had actually decided to be a bold climate champion.
Okay, Joan Racklin had her hand up.
Mark, thank you for a very clear and certainly enlightening talk. Scary, but helpful, certainly. I recently heard Eric Lander on a virtual Zoom talk about COVID and next steps, and he ended by saying, we've known about this. He had written about it a decade ago. Obviously, others had as well, including Bill Gates. And he said, we have to immediately start working on a follow-up plan and an action plan and, never again. But he ended talking about, if we think this is bad, we ain't seen nothing yet. And he started talking about the climate crisis and talked about how the two should be approached in terms of action plans as conjoined issues. And I wonder if you've heard of anyone who at the highest reaches of public policy and NGOs, are doing that crosstalk, the Bill Gateses, the Eric Landers, the MacArthur Foundation people, and other large green nonprofits, talking to who knows who, the Kerrys, the Gores. I just wonder if you're aware of, it just feels to me like it is being linked, and how to not just link it, but cement it going forward, now that we understand, or many of us understand and believe in the links. How do we capture the energy so that we don't just talk about preventing a pandemic, we talk about preventing many pandemics and many other kinds of crises from the climate emergency?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So before I jump into that, I just want to highlight two things that relate to your question. So I just dropped two things into the chat on the right. One is the Medium post that I and former advisors to Inslee, Warren, and Sanders collectively wrote, calling on Congress to pass a major green stimulus. That gets into a lot of, it's extremely long and gets into a lot of the details behind what I very, very briefly mentioned tonight. And the second is a brief post that I and some other collaborators wrote that looked at public opinion polling on this idea of large-scale green stimulus, finding that it's actually quite popular amongst voters. Very popular amongst Democrats, less popular amongst Republicans, although fairly popular amongst Republicans under 45, who are indeed very concerned about the climate crisis. So to get to your question more directly, yes, a lot of these conversations are happening. However, the Democratic Party, unfortunately, is rather fractured. I, full disclosure, I am a Democrat. I vote Democrat. That said, I think it's important for us to hold the Democratic Party accountable. So for me, climate denialism and climate delay are two sides of the same coin. The Republican Party has decided to engage in persistent climate denialism. That strategy is starting to fail them. We don't see fractures amongst the leadership, whether it be President Trump or Mitch McConnell. However, you do see significant fracturing amongst rank and file Republicans. Even for those in Florida, Representative Gates introduced his version of the Green Real Deal, as he calls it, but it's actually more progressive than any you could have ever gotten a Democrat to introduce, even just 6 years ago. So I actually do think that we're making some progress on that front, albeit slim. But unfortunately, as I mentioned a few times now, we just haven't had significant leadership from Democrats on the climate front. we had Governor Inslee running. For those of you who haven't looked at some of his plans, I strongly encourage you to do so. The plans that Governor Inslee put out are absolutely fantastic, and really lay a beautiful blueprint for how we can decarbonize the economy, but while doing so, actually strengthen the economy and bolster our communities and protect the most vulnerable people in this country. One of the major issues here, let me back up and say there's two major issues I think that we face. One is simply money in politics. So we know that the fossil fuel industry has not only bought Republicans, but they've also bought many, many Democrats and prevent them from passing bold climate legislation. The second issue that I see here is that people have been told time and time again that there's a major trade-off between the environment and the economy. They're told that climate action will be too costly, will lead to too much job loss, will result in all of us having to, resort back to only having one car, living in small houses, foregoing cheeseburgers, foregoing air travel, etc. But the fact of the matter is that that's actually not the case. And as I have done in quite a bit of my work, we show that we can actually increase economic growth and increase average wages for workers while simultaneously reducing emissions in the economy. Now, are those conversations happening at the right levels? They're to a degree, but certainly not enough. So, if we had Inslee, a Senator Warren or Senator Sanders come out as the front runner, I think we would have been in much better shape on the climate front. And having Biden as the front runner, I can tell you that Biden is much less concerned about the environment in terms of prioritization than other candidates that were running. But if you look at Biden's plan, I mean, it's a good plan. He has a legitimately good plan here. The question, though, is he going to prioritize it? Is he going to put his political capital behind it? And I don't think we see a lot of evidence of that to date. And that's something that we really need to focus our energy on is ensuring that if there's A, that there's a Biden administration, and B, if there's a Biden administration, making sure that they actually put climate at the front of the agenda, particularly because rebuilding the economy really shifts the Overton window and provides us with broad agreement that we need large-scale fiscal stimulus. Then it becomes, what do we spend it on? And the conversation we should be having is, what are our most pressing social needs, right? You go around and talk to Americans, what are the 5 most pressing social needs that they have? We need to make sure that climate is atop that list so that we get federal resources directed towards decarbonization efforts.
Great. Okay, let's see. Andrew, you got your hand up there.
Great, thanks. And I appreciate all the thoughtful questions and comments. Here's the thread I'd like to follow. This is what in legislation we used to call the F-35 problem. If you remember, that was a weapon system that nobody wanted. The Defense Department didn't want it. The Armed Services didn't want it. The Joint Chiefs didn't want it. But it passed anyway, and it passed because the general contractor put out subcontracts in all 435 congressional districts. And so the point that I'd like to make is that I think even though nothing will, it's virtually certain that nothing will happen this year on this, I think the way to build the groundswell on a conversation like this is to figure out who can do the legwork to say, here's what it looks like in your congressional district, Congress member, or here's what it looks like in your state senator. Because when we can break it down that way, we can start to have the kinds of conversations about disruption and job training and all of that infrastructure transfer in a way that's really on the ground. And I think for some of the Congress members who are either treating this as a hypothetical or who are getting funding from the fossil fuel industry or both, this is a great way to bring it right down into their district about here's what the economic benefits look like at home. So I'm wondering who does that kind of work and how does that tie in with what you're suggesting, Mark?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andrew. That's a fantastic, story and question. So, let me mention when FDR passed the Works Progress Administration, he did the exact same thing. So, you know, you can actually look up, there's something, if you Google Living New Deal, you can look up in your different congressional districts what Works Project Administration projects were actually done. Some of them were building schools and libraries. Some of them were building beautiful outdoor amphitheaters. Some of them were supporting local artists to build murals and the like. But, you know, and FDR was a brilliant politician and made sure that every single congressional district saw the benefits of the Works Progress Administration. I have argued elsewhere that under, you know, whether we call it a Green New Deal or economic recovery focused on decarbonization or what have you, that we should have the exact same type of program where we do bring these projects down to every congressional level. I've been working with Mike Siegel, who is currently running for Texas 10th. I encourage you all to check him out. He is a civil rights lawyer and teacher that is now in a runoff election down there. That's basically Austin, currently a Republican-held district. And he's doing a listening tour where he's going around to all the different communities and hearing from them what are the top priorities for decarbonization jobs in their area. Do they want community solar? Do they want to prioritize retrofitting their schools to help us actually save the school system significant costs, as well as providing a safer and more comfortable learning environment for their children? Do they want to focus on decommissioning the local coal plant, et cetera? So there are quite a number of politicians that are starting to do these listening tours to get feedback from their constituents and get them involved in the process. I think it's vital that we democratize this process quite a bit more, because there's plenty of work to go around. But I think that by engaging citizens in which program, helping us work through which programs we prioritize, that could be really essential. In terms of who's doing this work right now, though, I mean, there's no large-scale organization that's doing this work. The best that you could come up with is the Sunrise Movement, who I work closely with. They are doing large-scale listening tours, primarily targeted towards youth all over the country, where they're trying to understand how to get more folks engaged, and also what is it that those people want to see change in their communities, and then go and pushing their elected officials to hold them accountable. But I think that it's true that it's really easy to talk abstractly about let's create millions of jobs, and really different to say we are going to create 5,000 construction jobs because the government's going to locate a new plant to build wind turbines in X county of Kentucky. And that granular level of detail is much needed. What I can say is that folks are working with the Biden team right now, particularly in swing states, to develop targeted green investments and to actually give county level estimates in swing districts to be able to go out there and stump and talk to voters about those issues a little bit more clearly. But that's work that we need more of.
Really?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Let me see who else.
Do you want to go before me?
I didn't see who was answering. Oh, Bob.
It's Stephanie. I was just wait. I can start my video. I think. Not sure. Oh, hi. Thank you. That was a really great talk. I mean, one thing I was thinking in that regard that I had mentioned to Scott is, would it be possible to, if there's money available, to start some of these investments now and show some of the people who may be working in a coal plant job who could be retrained for building a solar plant or something like that. Start with online education now, and pay people to be learning those jobs online now when they can't be outside. Or they have to practice social distancing, and then people would actually see the results now because they'd be paid to train and learn at home.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for that question. It's a really important one. So as I mentioned, we put I put the Medium post link here in the chat box. And in that, what we talk about is the need for shovel-ready jobs. And of course, as we all know, we don't necessarily want to be sending people out to work right away. But that said, most of these projects have significant lag times on them where they have to go through a review, permitting process, environmental reviews, public comments, etc. So, starting the process as soon as possible is ideal because you need to it takes months to get those projects from passage to actual, breaking ground. But B, it allows you time to get your supply chains and your workers in place and, engage in some training if need be, and the like. That said, I unfortunately don't see much of a pathway forward under this administration for significant green investment. There's been a number of members of Congress pushing for it. I'm currently working with a large group of members in Congress that will be introducing a legislative text based on this Medium post that should be out in about 2 weeks from now. And so, there's a lot of demand for it, but it just doesn't seem that Mitch McConnell is going to let that happen. So I think that, it's important for us to think about ideally what would happen, and also for us to kind of face the reality of a Republican in the White House and a Republican-led Senate. I also briefly in the chat, there's a question about cement and concrete, and just wanted to briefly address that as well. So yes, cement, concrete, and steel are massive contributors of emissions. And I was going quickly earlier and I said, quote, we have all the technology needed. That's not quite true. We have the technology to decarbonize about 80 or 85% of the way. We don't know how to do the last 15 or 20% that's quite thorny. So things like air travel, things like steel and concrete, that are still quite large challenges for us in terms of decarbonization. First of all, there are massive improvements in building materials. So a new boom material is called cross-laminate timber, where they're actually building wood skyscrapers, particularly in Europe. Hasn't quite caught on as much as in the US, but I'll drop a quick article in the chat about that for folks that are interested. And these are essentially carbon neutral buildings, and one way to massively reduce the amount of concrete and steel in our built environment. The other thing is that you have many countries, particularly Sweden, dealing with processes to massively reduce carbon content in those in the production of those goods. So when you produce concrete, for instance, there's kind of two reasons why it's so carbon intensive. One is there's natural chemical processes that take place when you make concrete that actually releases carbon into the atmosphere. That's harder to deal with. The easier part to deal with is that these reactors have to get incredibly hot, are fossil fuel driven and aren't easily electrified. But in Sweden, you actually have the first electric arc reactors that are allow you to make steel and concrete while using electricity rather than using the direct combustion of fossil fuels in the production process. So when I talk about innovation policy, part of that is to say that yes, we still have a little ways to go, but I'm quite confident, and scientists are quite confident in numerous major papers published in leading journals like Nature, that we can figure out those last 15, 20% through learning by doing as we engage in decarbonization.
Right, so I think Raleigh, you wanted to ask something, and then we're kind of nearing the end of our hour here, so we'll probably wrap it up soon after that, but go ahead.
Mark, thank you for your talk. I just want to ask a simple question, which is, we keep talking about policy, and you very confidently said that you don't have confidence in this administration. I think it then leads to the question of waiting for a political answer to this may take a long time. It may not happen for a very long time. My question would be is, A, how do you offer people, a younger generation, hope and inspiration to make a change, and not just sit around and wait for politicians to make it for us? And furthermore on that, if you thought about, like, with the abilities you have, an fellow economist, of turning to the private sector and I'm just taking that last sentence that you said, which I believe in, that inaction is more expensive than action. Or if I got it the opposite, I apologize. But to educate the private sector and companies that going in a green way is actually, more economic for them instead of just not doing anything and not changing their old habits. So I'm interested in if you think that type of action in your education with your fellow economists to private sector could make a huge difference instead of just waiting for policy to happen.
Yeah, thank you for that those two-part question there. So let me take the first one and then I'll come back to the second. In terms of the first one, I didn't mean to imply that we need to wait for policymakers to do the job. What I meant to imply is that we need to build power now to then hold policymakers accountable when we get at least modestly reasonable policymakers in office. I don't think no matter how much power we build at this moment, we're going to be able to significantly, environmentalists writ large are going to be able to significantly sway Mitch McConnell and President Trump. I just don't think that's realistic. I do, however, think that a Biden administration could be much more easily swayed by a powerful environmental group. If we look historically, though, what we know is that there really hasn't been very many large environmental lobbies. There hasn't really been a very large environmental group that's getting tens of millions of people into the street and demanding action. We're starting to see that, right? We had Earth Day marches now for 50 years, which is great, but those are really quite small and quite niche. And building actual sustained political power is necessary to actually undertake large-scale policy change. That starts at getting local officials represented from the city council up to state, the state house, through the U.S. House and Senate. So it's something that can't just start at the top, but really has to start at the bottom. And this is something that a lesson that, for instance, the Koch brothers and the conservative movement has so fundamentally understood from the get-go, where they really focus on building the grassroots and focus on building strong state and local, conservative state and local governments to ensure that progressive action would be thwarted at every turn. So in terms of providing people with hope, I think we need to work on building power. I'd strongly urge any of you that are able to during these troubling times to donate to particularly youth groups like the Sunrise Movement that I think are doing tremendous work right now in getting the young generation energized and mobilized, and also help directing their energies towards demanding real change. There's another number of other good groups out there. Groups like League of Conservative Voters are doing a lot of really good work. And then, of course, the big green group that I think is doing the best work right now, although I certainly have a lot of my differences with them, is the Sierra Club. They are really come a long way in terms of understanding the fact that they need to build kind of relations between environmentalists and traditional union groups in order to actually build a large and sustainable progressive environmental movement that can wield real power in Washington. Sierra has, I'm not a big fan of HR 763 either. It has some upsides, it has some downsides. I mean, carbon pricing is great and all, but there are limitations to it. And I've done a lot of work on that I'd be happy to send folks to. And none of these groups are infallible. Sierra is also against cross-laminate timber, which I sent this above article about. But I think that they're probably the best group out there at this moment. In terms of your second question, your second question was, remind me real quick, was.
My second question was, do you think it's worth for economists like yourself to be educating the private sector and teach companies how to green their ways and actually prove to them that it's worth it for their pocket? It's not just better for the environment, it's better for their bottom line of their company.
Sure thing. So on that front, I'd say a few things. So one, I actually do talk with a lot of private business groups about this right now. And what they tell me is that they desperately want to decarbonize, that they understand the issue that is global warming. I mean, mainly I'm talking with kind of tech groups more so, but I was just at a Bloomberg Business Roundtable a few weeks before COVID hit in San Francisco. I was talking with a bunch of Silicon Valley executives, and they basically said, the biggest thing that they're waiting for is policy certainty. And this is another reason why trying to get administrative change is so important. Having somebody in the White House that just says, we are going to decarbonize by X date, let's say 2045, we're going to decarbonize the economy by 2045, not necessarily even passing legislation, which is necessary, but just promising a goal of this is going to happen. We're going to pass numerous pieces of legislation to figure out how this is going to happen, but we are dedicating all of our efforts to this goal. Provides a great degree of policy certainty that will unleash a tremendous amount of private capital to help meet that goal. But without that policy certainty, I think you have a real challenge in bringing about private investors willing to take that jump. That said, you have a lot of groups out there that are working with private capital. Regenerate Capital is one of the biggest ones. It's basically like a angel investor for green groups. I do think it's worth talking to companies more, but I also don't think that there's any way, shape, or form that we can address the climate crisis without large scale systematic change coming from the federal level. In the meantime, I think we should all be pushing to decarbonize at the local and state level as much as possible. Places like Massachusetts and California provide very robust examples to show that we can reduce emissions while creating new jobs and building a more robust economy all at the same time. And having actual concrete examples to persuade members of Congress from more conservative states is really important. And I think that that's where we should be directing all of our efforts in the meantime. It's really at the state and local level until we can change things at the federal level.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, we're kind of running low on time here, so I'm going to just, I guess, thank you so much for this wide-ranging and very interesting presentation. I've learned a lot on this, and I'm hoping we'll share this out to people that weren't able to make the call tonight. So thank you so much for doing that. I did want to ask if you, are you guys going back to school in the fall? Are there plans yet for New College to have students back? And
I will thankfully be on sabbatical, but New College is doing what I think is the worst of all possible worlds, perhaps, which is the hybrid system where students can choose to come back or choose to go online. But I will be honest, and I'm both not a public health expert, nor have I, so I don't know the right answer here. But thankfully I'll be on sabbatical and we'll be working on my new book instead. So that'll be the focus of my next year.
Well, I hope you'll keep
I
us.
greatly appreciate.
Go ahead.
Oh,
we
absolutely.
look forward to getting some updates on the book.
Thank you. And I greatly appreciate all of your time and all the work that you all are doing in your communities, and keep it up. And my thoughts are with all of you and your families during these troubling times, and stay healthy and safe out there.
Thank you so much. All right, we'll bid good night to anybody. If for those of you, we have a lot of new visitors here. If you want to, I'll put my email address if you want to get on our mailing list if you're not already. We'll send you some information about our next get together, which will be in approximately a month. And Dr. Mark Paul has put his information up there in case any of you want to put some contact on that, and I'll put mine on, and I'll download that and send that out to everybody so that you guys might have that. So thanks again to everybody, and be well, and we'll see you hopefully in another month. And thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.